Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contracts. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined today by both Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School, and it's kind of a bonus here for The Politics Guys, we also have Mike Baranowski, a professor of political science, formerly at Northern Kentucky University. Mike, thanks for being our third person on the show today.
I'm happy to be here with you guys. I don't know if I'm going to be able to handle doing a show without a MAGA co-host, but I'll do my best.
Well, we'll try to be a little extra MAGA for you, and we'll say things like, listen, the sky is not blue, it is Trumpian. And I don't even know. I don't know. I think today, unfortunately, Mike, I think what's going to end up happening is that we're all going to sigh a lot at...
Yeah.
That's what I think's going to happen. If you were hoping for MAGA balance today, it's not coming. But Mike, you were telling us before the show got started that we've actually got some really cool new people who are part of the Politics Guys supporters family.
Yeah, absolutely. There's Michael, who's a new yearly supporter on Patreon, as well as Eric. Eric's a longtime listener, a longtime supporter, and he recently gave us a very generous one-time donation through Venmo, which is a thing that people do from time to time, and we really do appreciate it. And so thank both of you guys, Michael and Eric. We really do appreciate your support. Thanks.
No, that's always awesome. I can't tell you how much it makes me feel amazing that people donate those monies so that we can do this. It's humbling. It really is. Okay, but let's get to the things that y'all are excited about. And I really thought that we had to start, guys, with Trump attempting to fire Cook. And so that's where I thought we'd look. And we've got a lot of firings to discuss and some quittings, but let's start here. Let's start with the Federal Reserve Board. Let's start with Federal Reserve Board member Lisa Cook. Now, President Donald Trump attempted to fire her this week, but on Thursday, she had filed a suit in federal district court arguing that her dismissal is, quote, unprecedented and illegal. Specifically because it is a pretext to control the Fed's decision-making process in that body. And there's a lot going on here. So let me break down a few things before we get into our conversation about it. First, federal law does in fact permit presidents to remove members from the board for cause. And that's going to be a really important term here because typically it's understood to mean serious misconduct or malfeasance. And Trump has claimed on Truth Social that he can fire her based on cause for currently uncorroborated allegations that Cook either lied or misrepresented herself on a couple of mortgage applications. So what about cause then? That's kind of the real big issue here. Unlike other federal statutes, for cause is not actually defined in the Federal Reserve Act itself. But many commentators have argued it would be part of the inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance passage. So again, what is it that Cook has done? Well, it's hard to say if there's anything been done illegal, But the head of the Federal Finance, Housing, and Agency, or FHFA, Bill Plaut, has sent a criminal referral letter to the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. And what he has sent in that letter is that he sees that she has potentially committed a mortgage fraud under criminal statute, or in his words, quote, falsified bank documents and property records to acquire more favorable loan terms, potentially committing mortgage fraud under the criminal statute, end quote. So in short, he is alleging that she has more than one primary home as her primary residence. Now, there's a couple of possibilities here. Of course, this could in fact be a civil issue, but civil issues, and Ken, I'm going to let you really get into this, but I at least want to start here a little bit, is a very different, when you enter into a contract with someone, there's an assumption that you've read and understood the contract. But to make it a criminal issue, that's a whole nother level. There isn't an assumption necessarily that you've read all of it. And so that's where we're going from here. Now, so where is this moving forward? Well, we can just leave that there and say that there is no real opportunity for anybody to respond to any of this because Bondi hasn't yet done anything with it yet. But President Trump has still said that this is the for cause that he can use to remove her. And this is particularly timely right now because there has already been a case at the Supreme Court, Wilcox versus Trump, that deals with a similar issue that has I don't want to say throwaway, but it does in fact have a small line about the Federal Reserve. In that decision, it's not a final decision, but in an unsigned opinion, the court did overturn a lower court stay on a similarly type of removal. However, they have this, again, interesting line in that 2-page unsigned decision that said this, quote, the Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured, quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States, end quote. And therefore, that makes it different from other agencies, like the participants in Wilcox versus Trump. So we got a lot of things going on here, but the short version seems to be Trump has wanted to change policy with the Federal Reserve, hasn't had a lot of success doing that with Powell, has found a potential quote unquote for cause with Cook, is going after Cook primarily, again, to try to have his particular lower monetary policy come forward. And he's doing that, in my opinion, as a presidency scholar, with the view of the unitary theory of the presidency gone amok. But Ken, since there's so much law going on here, I would love for you to start us off on your thoughts about this.
Sure. At first, I'll say, Trey, that was a really, really excellent summary. Like you actually, you got to every single fact that I was gonna bring up. But I'll try to give some analysis.
Thank you so much. I appreciate. Yeah. I've learned from my lawyer friend. That's what I feel like here.
So I'll try to put these things in a few contexts. Two things that you said that I'll emphasize. One is that this is unprecedented. So we've had the Federal Reserve Bank for a long time. And we've had that statute for a long time that allows the president to remove a governor for cause, but we've never in history had a president try to remove a governor for cause. So there's a little bit of uncharted territory in terms of, if we're trying to figure out, well, what does that mean for cause? One of the most usual ways to look at that would be to look at, the precedents, but we don't have any precedents. So then I think another thing that you sort of talked about, when you talked about malfeasance and inefficiency and things like that, there are sort of general definitions of what might be cause to fire a tenured civil servant, which is essentially what the Fed governor is. But those are not written explicitly into the Federal Reserve Act. So they seem like they should sort of be a starting point for thinking about this, but the court doesn't necessarily have to go that way. Like the court could say, well, yeah, that's what it normally is, but normally those words do appear in the civil service statutes. And, in this statute, the fact that those words don't appear maybe means that that's not the standard. So I think that kind of argument is also available. And then the final thing that you talked about was the Wilcox case. And I'd actually like to put that in a little bit broader perspective, because I think there's a lot of different precedents that could be applicable, of which that's just, it's the most recent, but it's also only a shadow docket case. So there's not a ton of explanation. But, so I think a lot of the question about which executive officers can the president remove from office unilaterally under our Constitution. Um, that debate actually goes all the way back to the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson. So when President Andrew Johnson was impeached during his term as president, after which he became president because of the Lincoln assassination, the exact charge that he was impeached for was that he had fired the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton, who was a holdover from he was Lincoln's Secretary of War, and Johnson became president, and Johnson purported to fire him, and he was impeached for removing someone from office unilaterally who actually had civil service protections. And I think the act that was in effect at the time was called the Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act said that if a cabinet secretary had their incumbency because they were nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, then they could only be removed if the Senate consented in their removal, and the president could not remove unilaterally. So that was part of the statute. Andrew Johnson violated that statute, but claimed constitutional authority to do so. He got impeached for it, but he did not get removed from office. He got it takes 2/3 vote, and he hung on by 1 vote. So there was a large majority that would have convicted him and removed him from office, but one vote short of the requisite 2/3 majority. So that's really,
and it's worth noting, just as a little historical note here, no president has ever been removed as a result of impeachment, just for context. But I believe this is going to be the closest it ever comes, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, the closest any president ever came to being convicted and removed from office in an impeachment trial was Andrew Johnson, and the charges in that case were basically that he did what Trump just did. So that issue gets aired out in the Johnson impeachment, but the impeachments are not appealable to court, and Johnson was ultimately acquitted anyhow. So we really didn't have a court weighing in on that. And by the time the Supreme Court first weighed in on these issues, it was 50 years later. And there were actually 2 cases that came down in a 9-year period and were inconsistent with each other. And that creates a lot of the confusion. So there was a case called Monarez versus United States, and there was a case called Humphrey's Executor versus the United States. And
that's the one I think is a little more potentially known. You know, even at undergraduate level, we oftentimes talk about Humphreys. But continue.
Yeah. So Monarez came down before Humphreys, but Monarez comes down the opposite way from Humphreys. So Monarez involves a postmaster in Portland, Oregon. And there's a changeover in presidential administration, and the new president says, "Well, I'd rather have someone basically who's in my own party having the postmaster job. I don't see why I should have a holdover from the previous administration. So I'm gonna fire the postmaster of Portland, Oregon, replace him with someone who's on my side of the political aisle." And that postmaster similarly had civil service protections, and no cause was offered. So this also violated the federal statutes, but the president claimed constitutional authority to do it. And in the Myers case, the court held that the president had constitutional authority to remove that postmaster, even though that violated a federal statute. And the court's reasoning in Myers was that the president has a constitutional responsibility to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, and that in order to be able to discharge that constitutional responsibility, if the president has to rely on his administration to execute the laws, and if there's someone in his administration who's in a position of responsibility who's not getting the job done, and therefore the laws are not being faithfully executed, then because of the president's responsibility to ensure that they are faithfully executed, the president has to be able to remove that person. So the Myers case, which is from the 20s, actually somewhat is, it would seem to suggest that the impeachment of Andrew Johnson actually was unwarranted, and that Johnson's position was constitutionally correct. But then just 9 years later, you get the Humphrey's Executor case. And Humphrey's Executor involved a presidential removal, not of a postmaster, but of a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. And the court in Humphreys says, well, for these multi-member so-called independent agencies or independent commissions that Congress intentionally sets up by statute for the purpose of having some insulation from politics, the rules are different. So the concept in Humphreys was to kind of distinguish between, who are the president's cabinet secretaries, and the president does get this unilateral authority from Humphreys to remove them at will. I'm sorry, from Myers to remove them at will. But Humphreys says, but that doesn't apply to the independent agencies within the government, and we mainly can tell which agencies are independent by the fact that Congress has set them up to be headed by a commission or a board, a multi-member head rather than a single member head, and Congress has given them a term of years in office and some statutory protection against removal. That if you have all that, then you've got an independent agency, and if you've got an independent agency, it can be set up by Congress to have a little bit more immunity from presidential policies, and so the president doesn't have to have the authority to fire at will. So the president was held not to be allowed to fire a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission because that's one of these independent agencies. But they didn't overrule Myers. They said the president can still fire people that are heads of agencies in purely executive branches, as opposed to quasi-independent or independent agencies. So this kind of thin line between the rules that applied to independent agencies and the rules that applied to executive agencies subsisted for like another 50 years. But then the next chapter in that story comes in the 1980s in a case called Morrison versus Olson. And this is a case about the independent counsel when we had the Ethics in Government Act. So people might remember independent counsels like the Robert Mueller, but 21st century independent counsels are completely different than late 20th century independent counsels. So Ethics in Government Act was enacted in 1974 after Watergate, and it expired in 1999. But during the 25 years that it was in effect, it created a mechanism, and this is really a response to some of the Watergate abuses. It created a mechanism where you could have an independent counsel appointed in the Justice Department who was very, very immunized from presidential control. So the independent counsels that were appointed under the Ethics in Government Act actually weren't even appointed by the president or by the attorney general. They were appointed by judges on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, who themselves had life tenure and couldn't be removed by the president. They were the people who would decide whether to appoint an independent counsel and actually who to hire as the independent counsel. And the independent counsel then was appointed into the Justice Department, but wasn't really subject to that much supervision by the attorney general, but could exercise all the powers that any other federal prosecutor could exercise. So seemingly, if you would stick with that older dichotomy between Myers and Humphreys and think, well, the question of whether the president can fire this person depends on whether we think of them as being in a purely executive department or whether we think of them as being in an independent agency. Well, they're actually in the Justice Department, and they have an unusual way of being appointed there. They have unusual protections against removal, but the powers and responsibilities that they wield are the same powers and responsibilities that federal prosecutors wield. And the Justice Department is clearly a core executive agency. It's not an independent agency. It's headed up by the Attorney General. The Attorney General himself is removable at will by the president. President Reagan, who was being investigated by quite a few of these independent counsels, and this wasn't even Morrison v. Olson didn't even come up under the most famous one of those. It wasn't even from the Iran-Contra investigation. It was from a different investigation about diversion of some of the Superfund money. But he argued that he had the right to. Reagan argued that he had the right to fire an independent counsel under the under the Myers precedent, because the independent counsel was in the Justice Department and was not in some independent agency like the Federal Reserve. But in Morrison v. Olson, an 8-1 Supreme Court sustained the independent counsel's protection against presidential removal, even though the independent counsel was in an agency that all 9 justices agreed was a core executive agency. But what they said in Morrison v. Olson is that maybe the really important line isn't the line between whether we call an agency executive or independent. Maybe the really important line is whether the removal protections could actually thwart the president's ability to take care that laws are faithfully executed. And so the way they applied that reasoning in Morrison v. Olson is they said, well, if you've got an independent counsel and he's looking into whether the president or the president's top deputies committed crimes, well, looking into that, is making sure that the laws are being faithfully executed. And if the president wants to fire him to make sure that he and his cronies can get away with crimes and not be investigated, then actually they're the ones that are thwarting the laws being faithfully executed. So unless a president can actually articulate some way that this person they want to fire is in fact undermining their ability to faithfully execute some particular law, that just sort of broad generalities isn't going to be enough. And that's what Morrison v. Olson says. So I think that was sort of where we were until the very recent cases. Now, I will say on several of these shadow docket cases, including Trump v. Wilcox, we only can read the tea leaves here because the Supreme Court hasn't really written good, solid opinions on any of these cases. But they seem to be suggesting that they are agreeing with Morrison, with the 1980s case, Morrison v. Olson, that it's not so sensible to draw a line between so-called core executive agencies and so-called independent agencies, that really all these agencies are part of the executive branch. But they also seem to be backing away from what Morrison said about really holding the president to a standard of having to articulate how is it that this particular federal officer is actually undermining his ability to make sure that any laws are faithfully executed. And certainly in this case, if the court was going to apply the Morrison standard, I think then the Federal Reserve Governor Cook would be on very good grounds, because there's nothing that President Trump has said that would imply that she's done anything inconsistent with the Federal Reserve Act, the act that she's supposed to be administering, or that she's incorrectly administered it, or that she's undermined his ability to take care that it's faithfully executed. All of the allegations refer to kind of minor conduct that took place a long time before she became a governor. And so I think, that if those kind of explanations are accepted, then I think that would undermine the idea in Morrison that even for core executive officers, the president can't really fire someone that Congress has given tenure protection to unless the president can articulate, what has that person done that has actually interfered with the president's ability to take care that some particular law that person is charged with administering gets faithfully executed.
Gatorade is the #1 proven electrolyte blend designed to hydrate better than water. So you can lose more sweat and raise your game. Gatorade, is it in you?
Hey, Fidelity. How can I remember to invest every month?
With the Fidelity app, you can choose a schedule and set up recurring investments in stocks and ETFs.
Oh, that sounds easier than I thought.
You got this.
Yeah, I do. Now, where did I put my keys?
You will find them where you left them.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
Well, I want to get you into that, Mike, but I want to bring us a little context, because this past week, J.D. Vance actually answered and talked into that very question, Ken, and was asked a version of that, right? What is the ground for this removal? And his answer was actually more stronger than it had to be. He starts by saying, well, obviously she's committed a crime and therefore, we can remove her. But he goes on to say, but even if she hadn't, the president has the sole authority to put his people into power, because that's what the American people elect presidents to do, to implement their particular will. That's the way that Vance is going to put it. Mike, on that kind of politics side, again, he could have taken a softer line, but instead, he just pushes that envelope as far as possible. What's your view here, both in light of what we've been talking about, but then the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing this week straight from the White House?
Well, on JD Vance, I'll note that he answered the question with a lie and a diversion, which I guess I should expect from JD Vance. I mean, the lie is that she obviously committed a crime, which has not been established by any means, right? Just, well, because Trump's attack dog says, well, I think she did. I mean, this hasn't been adjudicated in any way. This is some serious Banana Republic type stuff. This is just ridiculous. I mean, let's say that she did in fact commit mortgage fraud, or there was good evidence to believe that. We don't know that, right? We don't have any of that evidence. We haven't seen anything. So that's the obvious thing. That's the lie there. But even if that were the case, the procedure in that case, in a country in which the president had even passing concern for the rule of law and procedure, would be to go ahead and adjudicate that. And then if he were found guilty of having committed mortgage fraud, then the question would be, I think, to what Ken's talking to, I think Ken makes a good point, but we haven't even reached the point of having any kind of clear determination of whether this was the case. And that's why this is just insane. Everyone knows what's going on here. I mean, the three people that this attack dog Pulte is accused of mortgage fraud, right? Letitia James, Cook, and Adam Schiff. I'm sure it's just coincidental that there are three big. I mean, we know what Trump wants to do. He wants to get Cook off of the Fed before the September meeting so he can have one more person jammed in there to try to get the biggest basis point cut he can get. This is, anyone who knows anything about this, who isn't totally drinking Trump Kool-Aid, knows this is just utter crap.
Well, and I mean, true, but even worse in some ways is the fact that a rate cut could be, just financially ruinous for the average American citizen right now, given that inflation is still not down. I mean, I hate to be the economic guy on this front, but I don't think that has gotten a lot of attention this week. And I understand, rightfully so, in one sense, because, Mike, I think that your kind of indignation there is shared by most of us who pay attention to this kind of stuff, right? I don't think there's a lot of people out there going, this could be okay. There's a few, but let's be honest, it's the individuals inside kind of pretty deep into MAGA land, not, I would say, any kind of real scholarship. I wouldn't say really any kind of real political commentators. It's not even getting a lot of play in the typical news channels that might be for Trump. But if this in fact goes down, there's two interesting elements. I'm curious what you guys think about this. So I can imagine Trump still appointing somebody else to this seat, regardless of what the district court necessarily says. And if that's the case, we could have two board members both claiming to be the rightful vote. That in it of itself could be, I mean, you talking about a Banana Republic there a second ago, Mike. Talk about Banana Republic moments is, well, who is the one? Who's the Powell supposed to do? And here's my little thought about that is that could then be a way to attack Powell, to say you're not recognizing the rightful board member, and ergo now I have cause to do something about you.
I think we'll get a court determination before the Fed's next meeting, but yeah, again, it's so patently obvious. And the irony of this is that Donald Trump ran in part on de-weaponizing the justice system, and he's claimed through his entire life he's been railroaded by false charges and all that.
He is. But here's the problem. I hear that, but remember, it's not for everybody. It's the de-weaponizing it against the victim, Donald Trump. I mean, he's at least been honest about that, though, right? Like, I'm the victim. I'm the only thing standing between you and them. So you've got to the weaponization applies 100% only to Donald Trump.
Yeah. And I think another point in here is that, Trump has appointed now 3 of the 7 Fed governors and, the one who's still waiting confirmation. And so if he gets Cook out and his person in, he does have a 4-3 majority. But it's important to point out that there are still those 12 voting members of the Open Market Committee that sets rates. There are the 7 that are presidential appointees who serve those 14-year terms, and then there are the New York Fed governor, who's an automatic seat, and then 4 of the regional Fed governors who are there on a rotating sort of basis. So even there, he doesn't necessarily have a majority. I don't know that it has a huge difference on the September meeting or anything, but that's sort of beside the point. Anyone who cares about due process and rule of law should just be completely incensed at this sort of thing coming from a president of the United States.
Yeah, a couple. I do want to get back to the Vance argument. Every significant Supreme Court opinion decided, at least in the 20th century, and I talked about both Humphreys and Morrison in particular, directly refute Vance's argument that the president can fire anyone in the government, right? Humphreys says that the president can't fire heads of independent agencies, and Morrison v. Olson says the president can't even fire people in purely executive agencies that the Congress has wanted to give some protections to, unless the president can at least articulate how that person's presence is undermining his ability to take care that a law gets faithfully executed, that officer has some role in administering. So that's not to say that the modern corrupt Supreme Court wouldn't go the way Vance is suggesting, and to some extent, I think they actually will. Sort of my assessment of how the current corrupt Supreme Court works is different than my assessment about what the law is. And although I'm quite confident that Cook is going to win in every lower court, she's going to win in the district court in D.C. She'll probably get her temporary restraining order today or tomorrow. That'll end up being affirmed by the D.C. Circuit. But I think that by the time we get to the U.S. Supreme Court on this, I think basically, what Justice Jackson has referred to in a recent dissent as Calvin ball is exactly what's going to be played here, and that that you've got a range within the 6 Republicans on the court. You've got a range of how they play that Calvin ball, from people like Thomas and Alito, who just simply say, "Well, is Trump in this case? Then Trump wins. That's all we need to know." To people like Roberts and Kavanaugh, who will say, "Well, if there's a very clear precedent, we'll follow it, even if it's against Trump. But if there's not a very clear precedent, then in that case, Trump wins." And so here, I think it's not very clear on the question of what constitutes cause to fire a Fed governor. And I think Roberts and Kavanaugh would likely not agree with Vance's constitutional argument and would say that the statute can provide some protections. But if you actually look at this statute, the protection isn't absolute. It just says that the president can fire for cause. And I think since we've got no actual precedent on what means cause, then for those justices, that means the president wins. And so I do think all 6 Republicans are going to vote in Trump's favor here. But I think that'll be a few of them, the Roberts Kavanaugh wing, will avoid turning this into a constitutional holding. They'll reaffirm the old constitutional precedents, but they'll just say, but in this case, Congress did not give protection against firing for cause. Congress did not specify what cause is, and so Trump can have his way on specifying what constitutes cause.
I think you're right, Ken, but I don't think it has to do well. Alito and Thomas aside, who I consider sort of a special category, I think for Kavanaugh and Barrett and Roberts maybe, that it's more an issue of a belief in a strong unitary executive. I think that's just wrong, but I always want to make that distinction between wrong, or at least in my view, wrong on interpretation, and corrupt, as in Calvin ball. The only rule is that there are no rules, but Trump always wins. I don't think that's right, except for, again, I'm going to put Sam and Clarence in their own special little room there.
I mean, we don't have the counterfactual, but my view would be that if this was Biden, they'd rule against him. Same issue.
Okay.
That's interesting. Well, but I think the other thing, though, is it's hard to picture a universe in which Biden would have done this, because this is not the kind of action that we would have expected from a Biden presidency, right? I mean, I can't think of a moment in which Biden exercised power in this way. And so I hear what you're saying, Ken, but it's hard for me to even go there, since I think part of the problem, of course, is whatever you thought about Biden, he was a law-abiding president, right? Did he push the boundaries of executive power in some areas? Yes, but all presidents have done that. The difference is he was not leaping those bounds,
right,
and articulating, again, a very deeply unitary vision for the presidency in a way that I think is unique to Trump, especially in his second term in some ways. But I'm going to pause this there, gentlemen, so we can move forward. Not so much away from President Trump and unitary executive power, but rather just to maybe a different manifestation thereof. And so I want to talk here about the potentiality of troops, National Guard's troops, being deployed to additional cities around the United States, as it already has happened, as it has already been talked about here on the show in Washington, D.C. On Monday, President Trump said that the U.S. military might deploy to Chicago and is ready to go anywhere on short notice to crack down on crime. Now, we've already discussed that, but Trump has used the National Guard in Washington, D.C., and this past week escalated that use by allowing them to have and hold weapons during those periods of time. Quote, "We can go anywhere on less than 24 hours notice," end quote, Trump said this past Monday when asked about preparations for deployment for Chicago or elsewhere. He would go on to say, quote, "They need help. We may wait. We may not wait. We may just go in and do it, which is probably what we should do," end quote, as he was signing a variety of executive orders. Now, the Illinois governor said that his state has made no request for federal intervention, which is generally a requirement. States are far different. And I mean, legally speaking, they're completely different things from the District of Columbia. And again, we have talked about that in the show, so I'm not going to go through that, or other hosts have. I haven't personally. But despite the legality of it, U.S. officials have told news outlets that there has in fact been initial planning at the Pentagon about what a deployment of National Guard troops to Chicago would look like. As a matter of fact, on Thursday, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson told reporters that the Trump administration has not communicated any information about when or if the National Guard troops might be sent, but they are already preparing for the likelihood that they could be there in a similar way as to say when they've had conventions there. But the difference being, of course, they don't have any communication from the federal government. And so I just want to start by saying, this one, and more so even than our last story, this is the one that just strikes me as nuts. You know, Mike, you were kind of getting a little. This is where I'm just, what is happening? I am teaching right now both contemporary political ideologies, and I'm teaching my our basic American politics class, and we're doing things like the Declaration of Independence, and I'm like, check the box, check. Like, how do you be not biased about this one in a class? It's tough because, you know, we're doing classical liberalism, we're reading the Declaration of Independence, and I'm just thinking, maybe the three of us ought to be starting right. Trump, you have violated the rights of the fallen. This is kind of that Rubicon for me. I have given, when we talk to our supporters, we're on Discord, a lot of times there are people saying, well, when have we gone too far? And I keep saying, well, I still think we're inside of the guardrails. But here, I'm going to say it, I'm going to be honest about this. If we end up with federal troops without being requested in any city, I don't know. I think that is beyond the guardrail, gentlemen. That, more so even than the firing of Cook. I mean, military troops in cities with weapons, that's something else. And I'm going to pause there. And Mike, I'm going to turn it to you first, because obviously on this front, I mean, you served this country. This has to just be. I can't imagine it not being galling. Yeah, but I mean, I just can't imagine thinking to yourself like, my military. I don't. I'm sorry. Take it away from us, because I can't even imagine.
Oh, I'm all for it. Here's why. Because So President Trump said, we go in, we'll solve Chicago within 1 week, maybe less. Within a week, we'll have no crime in Chicago, just like no crime in D.C. So, hey, and in fact, he did end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. And so, yeah, President Trump's a man of his word. I mean, come on, let's bring him in everywhere. Cleveland, Toledo, Oklahoma City, man, troops everywhere. I mean, obviously, no, this is ridiculous. But I do, on your guardrails argument, Trey, while you recover from that.
Yeah, well, I just want, because people can't see me, we don't have a video feed yet. Mike waited until I was drinking some tea I just about spit over the microphone. I was laughing. Continue, Mike.
But I mean, I guess in terms of guardrails, I think Trump could justify it on a broader basis by declaring essentially a national crime emergency. And if you look at Title 10, Section, 12302, the president can federalize up to 1 million reserve troops for up to 2 years under that. Now, the question, of course, like with so many of these Trump emergencies, we used to say his favorite word is tariffs. I think his favorite word is emergency, actually, because it unlocks all these other powers. And I think that that's an incredible misuse. And I would hope that at some point a court somewhere will say, listen, this goes beyond any reasonable meaning of the word emergency. I'm waiting for the appeals court to do that on the tariffs, and I hope they do. I expect they will. And I obviously have more faith in the courts and the Supreme Court than say Ken does. I would like to think that when push comes to shove, eventually at the Supreme Court, they'll say, listen, we're willing to give a lot of deference to the executive over what constitutes an emergency, but I'm sorry, we can't go quite that far. I'd like to think so. I think we're going to find out for sure.
It is. The other thing that just strikes me about this is how from much, I mean, we oftentimes call the right conservatives, but they've just left all kind of real ideological conservative. This is not conservatives anymore. It has long not been conservatism. MAGAism is not. But here's an excellent example of this, right? So, for example, the whole framing of this is, well, of course, the president has to ensure particular types of crime levels, I guess, in cities. Well, let's be honest about this. One of the ideas of having states and cities is the idea is that you might have different kinds of processes for this. And if you don't like those processes, that's called voting by where you live, right? So I live here, you brought up, I think rightfully so, Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City, there's crime in Oklahoma City. It's not particularly terrible. I love walking around in Oklahoma. I have been downtown at all kind of hours. I've run around at all kind of hours. I make a point of actually being in places others won't, but that's a different question. Anyway, let's put that aside. But the answer is I have chosen to live here and to be here, and I am absolutely happy with our mayor and happy with the way that we approach crime. I don't want the federal government to come in to make a uniform standard for what that would look like. Maybe that's going to be different than what Chicago wants to do. Well, I don't live in Chicago. I don't vote for and so it is weird for me when ought something be a local issue? When ought it to not be a local issue? And it seems to me that the idea that anything ought to be local is just disappearing unless, Ken, you'll like this, right? Unless it happens to serve a particular mega purpose, right?
And Trey, I just want to point out that you say Oklahoma City is safe. Well, the per capita violent crime rate in Oklahoma City, I believe, is actually higher than it is in Chicago. So,
Well, no, and I say that not unknowing of that statistic. My point being is I feel safe here. Oh, heads up, when I went and I traveled to Chicago, I did the same thing in Chicago, right? Just to be transparent. So that is not a shot at Chicago. It is rather a point to say that I think that the idea that we're living in deeply unsafe places is a load. Because I am safe here in Oklahoma City in a real way. And as you rightfully point out, our numbers are actually a little bit higher than they are for Chicago. So I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I'm living precisely where. So if somebody says, well, would you live in Chicago? The answer is, of course I would, because I was just literally running around the middle of OKC with students, right? And never once did I think, uh-oh, I better be armed at this moment. You
All
know,
right, I'm sure some National Guard troops here. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, exactly. That would have probably made it a little. That would have actually been disturbing, and I don't think people realize this. Having worked and lived in D.C. for a little bit, having people walk around with rifles openly and pointing around, that's scary. That is, in fact, scary. And to be, a matter of fact, I'll never forget, I was taking interns and students in and out of the Capitol, and I ended up getting confronted. It's an interesting story. Well, I got confronted by some of the guards there. Let me just tell you what, it is not fun to have the guy be like, "We got guns pointing at you, friend." And it's like, why? Why?
You throw a sandwich at the entree.
It actually had to do with me eating cheese crackers, is the true story. You're supposed to throw those away, and I was hungry, and apparently that warranted weapons being pointed at me. And so, no, that actually is concerning. But here in Oklahoma City, we have some phenomenal police officers. I have encountered police officers. They've never once started from the position. They're not walking around with their weapons out, which is the default position for when you're carrying a rifle, right? And that is a different encounter with people. Okay, I've gone on too long. Ken, you need to weigh in on this.
This episode is brought to you by GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco. Get the most out of your vehicle with GM Genuine Parts and AC Delco original equipment. The only parts designed, engineered, tested, and backed by General Motors. You can find your perfect fit for most makes and models and choose from 3 tiers of parts, including GM OE or gold and silver aftermarket parts. Visit gmparts.com for more information.
When evaluating potential hires for your small business, it's essential you look beyond resumes. Sure, a candidate may appear impressive on paper, but understanding the person is crucial. LinkedIn, the world's largest professional network, provides a complete view of your candidate's skills, experiences, and interests. With LinkedIn's up-to-date data, you can be confident that you really know who you're hiring. Post your free job at linkedin.com/achieve. That's linkedin.com/achieve. Terms and conditions apply.
I just wanted to talk about the statutory framework a little bit. There are some conflicting statutes, so it's slightly complex, but my interpretation of how they fit together, which would be the same as Judge Charles Breyer's interpretation when he looked at all these statutes when Trump sent the military to Los Angeles. Judge Breyer, who's retired Justice Stephen Breyer's brother, is a federal judge, and he decided the case in California. So I think, to me, the most on point federal statute is the Posse Comitatus Act, which is a statute that was enacted right at the end of the Reconstruction. So we had the U.S. Army basically occupying the South for a little more than 10 years after the end of the Civil War. And that ends after the election of 1876. And the South, never liked being occupied by the Army. And they ended up, after they got reseated in the Congress, convincing enough members of Congress that there were bipartisan majorities who enacted a statute that's called the Posse Comitatus Act that just flatly prohibits the use of the U.S. Armed Forces to enforce domestic law or domestic policy within the United States, unless an exception is made by some other law, right? So the baseline that we have under the Posse Comitatus Act, which is still with us today, it's codified at Section 1385 of Title 18. And in fact, it's fairly short. I can read the language of it because it's just one sentence in the current iteration. It says, whoever, except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by an act of Congress, willfully uses any part of the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, or Space Force as a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 2 years or both. And so there is this really flat actual criminal prohibition against whoever tries to use the armed forces of the United States to execute the laws of the United States, and that would typically be directed against the president or against maybe the Secretary of Defense or even a general or somebody like that. So then we do have some.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to talk about that anyway. And so my question for you, Ken, is I have often wondered, is that really directed primarily at the president, or is that a way to say, if you follow illegal orders from the president, you can still be prosecuted.
Yeah, well, both, but it's also directed at the president. It's whoever. I mean, whoever is a very intentional term. So it's directed at the president. It's directed at the Secretary of Defense. It's directed at the deputy secretaries of defense. It's directed at the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it's just directed at anybody who uses the armed forces of the United States to execute the laws of the United States. That's actually a crime unless it's been expressly authorized by an act of Congress. Now, there are some acts of Congress that do expressly authorize that. So it's not like that never happens. So, very, very famously, I think it was President Eisenhower who used the National Guards to enforce the desegregation of the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas in the 50s. So that was using armed forces to enforce domestic law. But there actually were provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1871, a Reconstruction era statute that authorized that. So those hadn't really been used, but and they weren't specific to schools, but there were provisions that authorized military enforcement of court orders enforcing the Civil Rights Acts. And so, so once you had the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Ed, and Cooper versus Aaron ordering desegregation, and Cooper was specifically ordering it in Little Rock, and they still didn't do it. Then, under the authority of the Civil Rights Act of 1871, that would have created an express authorization, which would trump the Posse Comitatus Act. So the Posse Comitatus Act is saying that the federal military cannot be used for domestic law enforcement unless Congress expressly authorizes it. But when Eisenhower did that, that was because there was a statute that expressly authorized it. Now, I'm sorry. I would say the one and only thing that Trump has going for him is there's the Insurrection Act. Is that what you were going to say, Mike?
I was gonna mention that. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah. So yeah, the Insurrection Act of 1807, which is a much older statute than the Posse Comitatus Act, does purport to authorize the president to deploy armed forces in certain explicit situations. So that could constitute an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, but it's not. It never authorizes the use of U.S. troops to enforce state or local law. So to the extent that we're talking about, there's crime in Chicago. Well, a lot of that crime in Chicago or in Los Angeles would be crime that violates state law. A lot of it would not be crime that violates federal law. Your sort of ordinary everyday street crime. And the Insurrection Act does not provide an exception for that. It does provide an exception sometimes to enforce federal laws. And let me read the language of that. So this is the current iteration of the Insurrection Act, which is at Section 252 of Title 10. And it says, whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages, or rebellion against the authority of the United States make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the United States in any state by the course of judicial proceedings, he may call into federal service the militia of such state and use such of the armed forces as he considers necessary to enforce those laws or to suppress the rebellion. So the predicate for that, which might be a legitimate exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, would have to be that it's federal law that can't be enforced any other way, and that in particular the orders of federal courts are going unenforced. So if he finds that the orders of federal courts are going unenforced, then I would agree that the Insurrection Act would provide an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act. But I've definitely not heard Trump say anything like that, and I think it would be hard to make that case that there's federal court orders enforcing federal law, but yet they're not being able to be carried out because there's so much lawlessness. And I think most of the kind of lawlessness that he's talking about, there's no linkage whatsoever to federal laws or particularly to federal court orders. So I would say that the Insurrection Act exception has not been properly invoked, and that the general rule of the Posse Comitatus Act should apply.
I would say also one other thing, it's sort of a way around it, at least in red states, is that under it's Title 32, the state governors can mobilize they're state militias, but it can be paid for by the federal government. And in those cases, then those state militias are able to take on direct law enforcement duties. And so in that case, then they could use those troops, sort of immigration enforcement folks, like those 19 states now, almost all of them red states that have mobilized some National Guard troops, including Ohio, not Oklahoma yet, but maybe that's coming. I don't know. Because it seems to me that there are two things going on here, guys. Is that number one, it's a show of force, and Donald Trump loves looking like a strong man. And number two, it's a great way to ramp up the immigration, deportation numbers. And so it's a great twofer, because we know that a lot of folks just think that cities are these cesspools of crime and all that. And that's a very popular misconception. It's playing right into that. So I get why he's doing it. I just find it repulsive.
I hear that. Well, gentlemen, I think we should move forward to our next story. And again, I mean, I said we're going to have a lot of firing this week on the show, right? And so we went to insurrection as a sandwich between firings. And so this past Wednesday, Health and Human Services announced via social media, it's their favorite way, that, quote, Susan Monarez is no longer director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, end quote. Now, some layers here. She has countered that she has yet to actually have any lawful firing from Trump, and that as a Senate confirmed appointee, only a president may remove her. Now, it's weird, because if you're just kind of dropping into this story at this moment, you might think, what terrible Biden appointee is Monarez, right? Like, well, actually, heads up. Trump formally nominated her for the permanent CDC director role way back. I know it's hard to remember this far ago, March 24th of this year. And because of a Senate reform that required this, because of a law reform that now requires the CDC to get senatorial approval, she was just confirmed on July 29 in a 51-47 vote. It's going to be the first ever CDC director role that required Senate confirmation. It had changed back in 2023. So this, as a matter of fact, she was sworn in then on July 31st. I know, not that long ago. As the director by Robert Kennedy Jr. As part of the whole administration's MAHA, or Make America Healthy Again agenda. And so to be now moving her, I mean, the commentary that we're seeing about this is weird when you put it in light of that, right? I mean, we're talking that she has been serving in office not quite 2 months, appointed by Donald Trump and confirmed primarily by Republicans in the Senate. And she's being removed. Why? Well, the White House issued a statement, argued that she was terminated for, quote, not aligning with Trump's mission and refusing to resign. So far, 4 additional CDC senior officials resigned as a result of this, and they cite political meddling, anti-vaccine direction, and threats to public health. As a matter of fact, in a really kind of cool bit, I have an interview with Dr. Tyler Evans that will be coming out later that I just recorded yesterday, and we got to talk a little bit about this as well, in a little bit more detail in terms of the public health side of things, in terms of his new book. So be looking for that soon. But this is what they're arguing, and they have in fact left. Now, yesterday on Thursday, Kennedy then publicly stated that the CDC must now follow Trump's agenda and emphasize restructuring for alignment with administration goals. But again, that's a really weird commentary to be coming 60-ish days after you have this CDC director come in, which leaves, I think, many of us who are paying attention to this kind of stuff in a deep way, I think probably even more puzzled than the way that the news has handled this. I think the news has really kind of focused on this as, bureaucrat versus Trump and that kind of standard go. But again, that overlooks the fact that we are talking about a recent Trump appointee being now recently said bye-bye to. And gentlemen, I'm curious about what your thoughts are on this. And I'm not sure who you guys would like to go. Why don't we start with you, Mike?
She was. I'll point out that Monarez was Trump's second pick. The first guy he nominated, I forget who it was. Basically, he was told that he won't get past confirmation because he's not qualified enough. And so I think it could be just that she kind of came in there later on. They thought she would play ball, and pretty clearly she wasn't okay with saying, "Oh yes, vaccines are the worst things in the world, and so we can't have any more of them, especially those evil mRNA vaccines." And so, I mean, it's not surprising. This is like the gang that couldn't shoot straight when it comes to personnel matters, I think. So not terrifically surprising to me. But I think one of the people said this is just politicizing, weaponization of public health, and it's not surprising, right? I mean, Kennedy from the beginning made it clear that he does not believe in vaccines. You guys probably remember at the confirmation hearings, he made a bunch of promises to Bill Cassidy, who's a medical doctor, also the head of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, who was a pretty important person in getting Kennedy confirmed. He's already broken the promise to maintain the structure of the vaccine panel. He broke the promise to give Cassidy's committee advance notice of major changes, and he's only really partially kept the promise to give the committee input into appointing new folks. So he basically lied his ass off. We knew this guy was going to be a train wreck coming in. He was a horrible nomination, and the senators who voted for them should be ashamed at the very least.
Yeah. Ken, thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know if she's going to sue. I don't even really. I should have looked into this, but I don't know what the statutory standard is for firing someone in her position, or whether she even had any civil service protections. But my thoughts really go more in the direction of Mike's, that this is it's something that was obviously predictable, that the Republican senators who wanted to close their eyes and stick their fingers in their ears during the confirmation hearings, had the responsibility to see this coming. It was obvious to everyone who wasn't a Republican that this was coming. The one silver lining,
Let's be honest, it was obvious to many of those senatorial Republicans, and they made early comments about it. And they simply chickened out, is what it boils down to. I mean, I'm not willing. I mean, I think you're framing there, maybe because you're coming from the other side of the aisle, maybe too generous in a way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, but it was apparent. Numerous senators recognized, made comments, and early corrections to RFK Jr., but voted for him anyway. And that, in my mind, is actually a little bit worse than being duped. Right, because there was nobody got duped in this sense. In other words, it wasn't even, they recognized this. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's right. One silver lining, I think, on the cloud of because of how public this whole thing went, and when the Susan Monarez was fired, or I don't know if I know there's a little bit of a dispute about whether she was actually fired, but I guess she was fired. But
yeah,
she was saying that she never got.
Here's the dispute is that just having RFK or the services posted on social media is not in fact notification from the president. Right. And to this point, it is unclear that President Trump has done, and again, I'm starting to get a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but has actually did not in a direct way communicate to her a firing, which means that she would still be operating until the point at which she is. So she's not disputing that she can be fired, but rather that she has. You can't fire me via a social media post that didn't even come from the White House, effectively.
Right. Yeah. So there's that little thing, but I mean, ultimately, in the end, like
they're going to do it, right?
Yeah. But I think the fact that became a very public thing, and then a lot of the civil servants that were her top deputies very loudly resigned because of that. I think all of that is causing some pushback that. It's making this go public enough that, I actually did check this morning. I said, well, I wonder, with the COVID vaccine changes that he announced, how hard is it going to be, say, for me to get a COVID vaccine? Because I'd still like to keep getting them. So I went on the Walgreens website, which is the place I usually get them. And I said, well, I wonder, can I still just schedule it? So the online scheduler, if you say I want the flu shot, you could just schedule it. Now, if you say that I want the COVID-19 shot, what it does is it says, okay, do you have any of these conditions? And it gives us a long list of conditions, and one of them is actually just overweight. So if you say, yes, I'm overweight, which, sadly I can say, and and they're not verifying that either. They're just asking, are you overweight? And you could say, yes, I'm overweight. Then they'll go right ahead and schedule you for the COVID shot just like before. So I had been concerned, well, are people going to have to go to their doctor and get a prescription to get the COVID shot? And, is that going to, end up chilling quite a lot of people who would otherwise get it from getting it? But so far, that wasn't my experience when I checked the
I will say
website.
This morning, though, when you take a look more nationwide, there are shortages in 15 states as a result of some of those authorizations differences. Now, that relates more to the FDA rather than we're talking about here in terms of the CDC. So on the 27th of this month, the FDA authorized new COVID-19 vaccines from Pfizer, Moderna, and Novavax. But it's, as you're noting, that's radically different because if you're not over the age of 65, you're not immediately eligible. And if you're under the age of 5, you're no longer eligible. And so the question becomes how many of these will actually get made and come out. So that is an interesting question. The 15 actually comes, NPR this morning was reporting some of those shortages, but I was listening to that as I came into the office this morning before the show. So I just want to make that really clear. I have not investigated that myself in a way that I have normally done for things.
Well, but that's interesting because shortages, though, Trey, that's kind of the opposite of what you would have, like, if people who were going to be demanding that they want to get the shot, and then Kennedy's order had just made it harder for them to get the shot, then you'd actually expect surpluses of supply rather than shortage of supply, right? You would.
That's a good. I mean, again, that is why I'm being very transparent in the fact that I'm not. It seems unusual. I'm not sure how to answer that.
Yeah.
What's more concerned to me is, the media tends to frame these in terms of personnel battles, right? Trump versus the bureaucrat, that sort of thing. I'm more concerned about the real policy implications. Like, RFK Jr. has already, I mean, we know how he feels about all the research for decades that has found there is no link between vaccines and autism. He told Tucker Carlson they were trickery. They're full of conflicts of interest. And he's canceled over $40 million in autism-related research grants. He said nothing about Trump administration rollbacks of all kinds of EPA regulations that are linked to pollutants and chemicals that we know are linked to autism. And not only that, but and other. This guy hates mRNA vaccines with a passion. Moderna had been given a $600 million grant to work on a bird flu vaccine, which, I don't know, that seems like a pretty good thing to me. And he canceled that because, well, it's mRNA and that's just dangerous. I mean, this is dangerous stuff that's going to be, that there's a really good likelihood of costing a lot of people their life. So it's not just Trump appointee versus bureaucrat. People's lives are hanging in the balance here. And once you lose 6 months, a year's worth of research, that's a big deal.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point, Mike. And I think one of the things that we lose in this is this idea and the definition of science has been so skewed and maligned. And so for listeners, if you're talking about this, when we talk about the science, what makes what RFK is talking about here not scientific isn't that you couldn't and want to investigate things like autism. The problem is that RFK approaches things with unfalsifiable claims that he advances. And so here's just like a 30-second promo for, you want to think about like what makes science or my data analytics class. And the answer are your claims falsifiable? And so we don't prove claims. Instead, we find supporting evidence for claims. And these claims, we're not pulling them randomly out of the air. That's another misnomer. Rather, they are linked to ongoing conversations that have already occurred by, you guessed it, taking a look at empirical data. And so we look at that, we make additional edge claims, and then we find additional data, and we see if that supports the claim or not. And if we have claims, and if I kind of talk about this in terms for students, I'll say, look, if you want to save yourself a lot of heartache when you're having a complicated conversation with somebody, early on, ask them this question. Is there any universe of possibility of evidence that would demonstrate to you that this claim is false? And if their answer is either no or some trickery version of that, which is to deflect and go, well, but we've never actually. Okay, I hear. Just tell me, could there be? Right. And that is the problem of RFK. He has particular positions, and no matter what happens, it has to be that there's problems. And why do we know this is the case? So just this past week, what did he say? I'm looking out at children and I can see all their mitochondria. Oh, you can you? Well, let's do a quick study. That is nowhere in any literature, zero. I don't say that often about things. Zero. There's nothing. So he is making a completely baseless, out of the air claim, suggesting that that is evidence-based, while at the same time he is dismissing actual evidence that is not supportive of any of his particular positions. That's what makes RFK Jr. dangerous. It's not that ask hard questions, right? It's not, I mean, he can, and did he ask hard questions? Great. Woohoo. That's though the fundamental problem that is oftentimes lost in this conversation. And that's what makes talking about something empirically and scientifically different than just air thoughts. Ken, I went on far too long. How would you like to finish on that?
No, I agree with all that. I mean, it's appalling that someone like him is the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And ultimately, I think all the other problems you guys are identifying just flow down from that.
Absolutely. Well, gentlemen, I think that we have probably gone on and tackled enough for one show. Any last thoughts?
It's been a bummer of an hour, guys. I'm pretty deflated. I shouldn't have come on. Pop a gummy or something. I don't know, man.
We should have done that beforehand, right? We've always talked about doing the bonus show, pop a gummy, and then we'll do the... I still think that could be like we reach some milestone and the hosts are going to do a post gummy show. Like that feels like that feels like a good plan to me. But be that as it may, now I can just we'll see if this is too late. Nobody who's going to hate us are going to be listening at this point, right? They're not going to get to this. They're never going to know all the things. Now, I do want to say though that just because this show is ending and it's been a lot of fun doing it with both of you, that doesn't mean that we're done. Here in a few minutes, we are going to be recording our supporters exclusive show that we always do each week, and this week we're actually going to be getting into the 25th Amendment. It's crazy. Ken and I have now. I was doing the math here, Ken. This fall will mark 2 years of us going through the U.S. Constitution. We would have started it 2 years ago, late September, and I think we're going to get back to almost exactly that point when we finish to the 2-year mark to have gone through the Constitution. So I would love for you to be joining us for that show. But if you're going to be joining us for that show, it means you need to be a supporter of the Politics Guys. And it only takes a couple of minutes. You can head down to the show notes, or you can head to politicsguys.com/support. You can also always email us at mail@politicsguys.com if you have questions, or if you're in one of those positions, and I understand, where you'd like to have access to that show, but you're not financially in a position to do so. So again, reach out to us there. If you've liked this episode, please please rate, subscribe, or review the episode and send that. That is a great way. Sharing episodes is huge for our level of show. And I want to give a particular shout out to all of our executive producers who just, thank you so much, guys. They are Wilmer Marino, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza. We'll be back with a new
Miller.
And Jody Miller, that's right. I got to Jody, I'm so sorry. And Jody Miller, we'll be back with a new full episode this weekend. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,